They say that nothing is more difficult to predict than the past. And how we view the past depends on the questions that we ask.
Everything that's happening now has happened before in different ways, and it's preserved here at the Gennadius.
People knock on my office door and they're holding one of the books, and they say, "Look what I found." The Gennadius Library opened its doors to the public in 1926. Many of the books are rare materials that were part of the private collection of John Gennadius, a Greek who was ambassador in London in the later part of the 19th century. With the foundation of the Gennadius, it is the whole scope of the American school that changed. That in fact it doesn't stop with the end of antiquity as other institutions do, but it continues and strives to actually understand and study and gather materials for the history of Greece through the ages. The library is a place that is fascinating with all the treasures that it has. We have the Byzantine manuscript that was written in Asia Minor in the 1240s. The first printed edition of the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, which was printed in Florence in 1488. The first printed edition of Erotokritos, which is a poem and theatrical play that was written in Crete. Wonderful travelers' books, French, German, British, who came to Greece.
We have the papers of Heinrich Schliemann, the papers of George Seferis, Odysseus Elitis, but also we have expanded our modern Greek literature collection to more recent literary generations.
Dimitri Mitropoulos, a colossal conductor, on the level of Toscanini. We have his archives here at the Gennadius. To see the history of Greece and of Hellenism preserved here the way it is, of course, it's fantastic for me as a Greek American. And I have to ask myself, what can I do to help that?
We try to find funding to digitize our collections.
The digital library is a world to be discovered. There are things and mysteries and secrets that are hidden in there.
You can teach a class in the United States and you can see live what we have here in our collections.
We have lectures and symposia and exhibitions that attract a wider public, and this has brought more collections and more materials into the library.
We discover new treasures that we didn't know existed.
I think it's astonishing that the Gennadius houses the most amazing personal items in the possession of Lord Byron, a long-lasting figure for the 19th century. This combination of the most monumental, but at the same time human aspect of his life is of itself what makes Gennadius unique, but also what drives scholars and philologists in their approach to the past.
They study the Greek world, which is much bigger than Greece. The Gennadius is the best library in the world for post-Byzantine Greek history. This is a place where I am comfortable. This is a place where people understand what I am doing.
It's impossible to study the classical past without being aware of how that past was studied in the 19th century. It's impossible to move from the French Revolution to the more radical and democratic politics of the mid-century if you don't examine what happens in the support of the Greek Revolution for independence. All these questions are vital today.
Thank you all for your applause. Your Eminence Archbishop Elpidophoros, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. I'm the director of the Gennadius Library, Maria Georgopoulou, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to the Thalia Potamianos lecture series on the reception and continuing impact of Greek thought and culture. This program strives to create a stimulating environment to draw academics and the general public alike to the American School of Classical Studies and the Gennadius Library. In fact, these lectures are both a bold reminder of and a mechanism to empower the wish of the founder of the Gennadius Library, Ioannis Gennadios, to make the library a world center for the study of Hellenism from antiquity to the present. I like to refer to this fine rare book library as the Ark of Hellenism. As you saw in the film, it houses precious editions of the Greek classics, medieval manuscripts and thousands of historical maps, priceless botanical books, Ottoman costume albums, unique travelogues, and archives of poets and politicians that tell the story of Greece and its people. After all, for Ioannis Gennadios, the acquisition of books was literally a medicine for the soul. The repository of Hellenism's treasures is a haven for students of its history. The interests and discoveries of the dedicated scholars who use the library, historians and philologists, architects and archaeologists, book collectors or artists produce books, generate lectures and symposia, and spawn exhibitions, and of course, many ideas. It is our hope that you will join them in exploring the library, both in person and online. We love giving tours, so we expect to see you soon in Athens. The Thalia Potamianos Lectures is a visionary initiative conceived and funded by Fokion Potamianos in memory of his grandmother Thalia, a philanthropist who worked to protect those most at risk during the Second World War and its aftermath, and those who returned often from the war orphaned and destitute. A refugee from Constantinople herself, she believed in the principles that drove Ioannis Gennadios, and these principles are that being Greek was a state of mind and not a state of being. I would like to thank Fokion Potamianos from the bottom of my heart for giving us the opportunity to celebrate through these lectures the very essence of our beloved library, making all those who partake in our education, me and you all, Greeks. It is this aspect of Greek culture that our distinguished lecturer, Peter Frankopan, has been exploring this year. It is my great honor to say a few words of introduction about someone who truly needs no introduction, especially in New York City, Dr. Glenn Loury. Trained as a historian of Islamic art, Glenn Loury has had a stellar career as a scholar, curator, and museum director. 27 years ago, he took the helm of the Museum of Modern Art, a jewel among New York's fine museums. His leadership, expertise, imagination, and perseverance have transformed the modern, not only in terms of bricks and mortar, or in terms of new strategic alliances, but also in reconfiguring the very essence of this iconic museum. He has put MoMA at the center of conceptual and visual developments in the arts globally. In its gallery, you can now explore architectural developments in Asia, together with the new visual languages that African artists around the world are introducing against the background of various cultural trends that were born not only in the West, but throughout the world.
Good evening, and thank you so much for those wonderful and kind words, Maria. And most importantly, for making me and all of us honorary Greeks, at least for this evening. Every once in a while, you get to do something that has both personal and professional meaning. Introducing Dr. Peter Frankopan tonight is one of those moments. As a scholar of Islamic art, and especially the art of Iran and Central Asia, Dr. Frankopan's work resonates on many levels with my own interests and brings into focus through the reverberations of classical antiquity, one of the most important regions of the world. But at another level, this evening honors a remarkable woman, Thalia Potamianos, and the legacy of her equally remarkable family. To her grandson, Fokion, whose generosity established this lecture series that celebrates the Gennadius Library in Athens, we owe a great deal of gratitude. And to her daughter, Eleni, a friend of over 40 years, through your intelligence and radiance, I can imagine what your mother must have been like. Thalia Potamianos' story is particularly meaningful today with all the turmoil that surrounds us. She lived through fraught times with many parallels to ours, surviving numerous transitions, upheavals, and setbacks. Yet she found a way to prosper and succeed by caring for others. Born in Turkey on the eve of the First World War and the twilight of the Ottoman Empire, she grew up in a Greece shaped by the tragic events of the Second World War. That she was able to have such a formidable career is a testament to her strength of character as well as the humanistic values she espoused. As we look at a world again in crisis, reeling from 2 years of a pandemic that won't end, riven by racial and economic inequality, and with the specter of another world war in the making, her legacy has much to teach us, as does Peter Frankopan's deep insights into the many forces that shape our present. Tonight's talk is the third and final lecture in the series, Global Greece, a History. The first lecture occurred in Athens in October, and the second in Washington, D.C. in March. And together they sought to create a context for understanding Greece's past through a global lens in the dissemination of its legacies across time and space. This evening, Dr. Frankopan will chart Greece's story from its independence in 1821 to the present, situating Greece and its social and political cultural context in a rapidly changing world. A polymath, noted cricketer, I'm very jealous, and hotelier in his spare time, Dr. Frankopan is comfortable talking about ancient Greece and medieval Iran just as he is about Greece. He is professor of global history at Oxford University, where he is the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Director of the Oxford Center for Byzantine Research and senior research fellow at Worcester College. He is also associate director of the program for Silk Road Studies at King's College. In 2012, he published The First Crusade, The Call from the East, which was widely praised. Many of you may have read his most recent book, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World. A small measure of its success is that I received not one, but 4 copies of the books from friends and family who know of my interest in the intersection of late antique and Byzantine worlds with the rising force of successive waves of Muslim dynasties in the Caucasus and Central Asia. As the crisis in Ukraine and Russia reveal, the long history of the classical world continues to shape our present. It is not simply a matter of geography and religion, culture and politics that define the way we understand large parts of the Mediterranean and Eastern European worlds, but also the legacies of the Byzantine and Ottoman empires, not to mention the ghosts of the Mongol and Timurid dynasties. Their histories, with all their contingent and intersecting possibilities, with all their competing claims to power and control, clearly haunt the way many in Russia today, including its president, see themselves. This terrain is explored in beautiful detail in Dr. Frankopan's sweeping chronicle, The Silk Roads, that builds upon his deep understanding of antiquity and his interest in the way trade and commerce, wars and empire, people and places refract multiple waves of migration and trade, the meeting of many different artistic traditions, from music to poetry to architecture and the visual arts. It has been a melting pot and crucible of religions and political systems, all of which form part of our real and metaphorical DNA. We are fortunate to have Dr. Frankopan to help guide us through this complex terrain and to help us understand Greece's place in today's world. Please welcome Peter Frankopan.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Your Eminence, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, and some friendly faces. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and also for solving the riddle of who keeps putting copies of Silk Roads on eBay. I didn't know it would be Glenn for getting too many copies. It's been such a pleasure and a privilege to be involved in this lecture series. This is the last of three, and it's been a real honour to be the inaugural speaker in a series that is both extremely generous but also incredibly well organised. It's not every day that things work and work well, so I'm very grateful to Fokion and his family, to Maria Georgopoulou, to everybody behind the scenes, who I'm not going to thank by name, but from miking me up to making sure I'm in the right place at the right time. So thank you very much. And also to the American School and the Gennadion, the Board of Trustees and Overseers. So when I was asked to give these lectures, I'll try and, there's an echo, there we go. I thought it would be a good idea to talk about something ambitious and to try to pick a big topic rather than something I already knew backwards, which probably isn't the best thing to do because it makes a lot of work for yourself rather than coming and singing your greatest hits. But one of the points, I think, of being a historian is to be trying to open up new topics and to try to think about the world in a different way. So I'm going to talk tonight about futures, but I'm going to take the story on from the first two lectures. And for those of you who came to one or both, I'll give a sort of very quick edited highlights because there will be a book in due course about this too. One, I suppose, is the fact that when I was a schoolboy and I learnt about ancient Greece, no one explained to me where that golden age of Greece came from or where it went. How come the Greeks stopped being so very clever around about the year 300 BC? Then the Romans were the ones who worked out how to make literature work. So that golden age of epic literature, epic wars, brilliant philosophers and thinkers, I tried to work out how that connects to other cultures happening at the same time, which was not the Greece that I learnt about, that just appeared and popped out of a vacuum. There was no connection that the ancient Greek world had with Mesopotamia, with the Nile, the Indus Valley, and even beyond. So I talked in the first lecture about how to structure a way of thinking about Greece over geographic and also chronological time as well, trying to work out where these kinds of ideas came from, taking us up to around about Alexander the Great, and explaining why it was that Alexander is still a heroic figure in places like Malaysia and Southeast Asia. These stories, as Dr. Larry mentioned, spread over time. They carry across continents, across oceans, as I am here with you today. It's quicker than in the past, but it still happened that people heard ideas and passed them on. I talked also about why there was so much interest in the classical world as Europe started to wake up from the late Middle Ages onwards, and how the past was used to frame contemporary in the West, and why it was that young men were taught how to declaim the Iliad at school, not only to familiarise themselves with Homer's poetry and his language, and to learn about war and service, but also that classics could be used and was used as a tool of exclusion, because learning languages costs money, you need to be able to go to school and not work in the fields, and to try to think about more generally about why it is that we celebrate classics in this way. There's no shame in it, but it's important to understand it. In the second lecture, I talked about legacies of Greek art, religion, and ideas, and identities that run deep across Central Asia along the networks that are known as the Silk Roads, and I looked at how important Greek language was and Greek script was in facilitating the spread of Christianity, above all into Asia. Christianity took much deeper roots in Asia, I suppose, not surprisingly, because Christianity is an Asian religion. It's the fulfillment of Judaic prophecies And the articulation, the creation of episcopal sees across Asia happened much faster than it did in Europe. In fact, probably until about 1300, there were more Christians living in Asia than there were in Europe. I talked about the history of the Byzantine Empire, Byzantine Empire, when you invite us back to revoke your independence. The British are waiting because Theresa May, when we did Brexit in the UK, Theresa May said that Britain's greatest days lie in front of us rather than behind us. And as a historian, that's got to be good news if you're British. Anyway, the Byzantine Empire, which has been woefully ignored by scholars for not just generations, but for many centuries, but now is one of the most vibrant areas and regions and periods in all studies of history, and in fact even in the humanities. But the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine as an adjective, is still a byword for over-elaboration and for political intrigue, rather than thinking about a political structure, cultural, religious entity that survived for 1,000 years, or more than 1,000 years, from the foundation of the city of Constantinople in 330 AD until the fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. That's a very long time to look over a multi-climatic, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-climatic area that at different times changed in its boundaries, but has been ignored by historians and pushed out of the side of history books. So I looked at why that was the case, and I also looked at how it's been interpreted in very different ways, and in particular, how it's been interpreted in Russia in the last 30 years, and above all by the circle immediately around Putin, where discussions about Byzantium, about its fate, about the legacy of being the third Rome, as how Moscow has a long tradition dating back 450 years, if not more, is playing out in today's catastrophic situation in Ukraine. Today I'm going to talk about Greece in the modern era, and I'm going to cast my eye a little bit into the future at some of the challenges and opportunities that are facing Greece, but to try to take as wide a perspective as possible to stay true to the title of these lectures as being about global Greece. So in that sense, I suppose being here in the United States to give this last lecture is entirely appropriate because, well, of course, for one thing, let's see that it works, yeah, great. The American School at Athens, my hosts for this series, was founded by a consortium of 9 American universities in 1881 with the aim of promoting intercontinental ties, encouraging research and scholars from the US to learn about Hellenic culture. All institutions need funding, otherwise no scholars. Its magnificent library was named after Yanis Gennadios, here's the picture of the library behind me, a Greek diplomat and a writer who, together with his wife Florence, donated his extraordinary collection of books in 1922, and in his gift deed, he did it in token of our admiration and respect for your great country. That's you guys, Americans. In the confident hope that the American School in Athens may thus become a world centre for the study of Greek history, literature, and art, and as Dr. Georgiopoulos said, both ancient, Byzantine, and modern. Breaking periods up arbitrarily doesn't always help us. So if the American School and John and Florence Gennadios provide the inspiration for these transatlantic ties, then so too is New York the ideal location for this lecture. It's a city with links that are so strong that, having wasted too much time looking at the wonderful online displays at MoMA, I came across this at the Museum of Modern Art, and even better, I thought, what a great thing I just wanted to check it has 127 5-star reviews, no 4 stars. So please puff that up as well if you can. And it was described in the early 90s by the New York Times as perhaps the most successful cup in history, after its annual sales reached 500 million a year. How about that? But this is a symbol of coffee of your city, of people talking to each other, convening, getting the rocket fuel to get them to work in the mornings. So if I had a fourth lecture, I would, and definitely would need at least one, would walk you through some of the buildings in this wonderful city that have been inspired and influenced and modelled on Greek art. I'll just pick a couple while I'm here. One is the Federal Hall, original on the left-hand side behind me, which was where George Washington was inaugurated as president. It's where the first Congress was met, and it was where the Bill of Rights was signed, a fundamentally important site. And then the building knocked down and rebuilt in the 1830s. And then I've always had a soft spot for the Farley building on 8th Avenue, which is not only inspired by classical architecture, but also adorned with the words of Herodotus that alludes to the determination of US postal workers. If there's any postal workers, I know it's not the motto of the US Postal Service, but still, but it talks about the determination of US postal workers to get their deliveries to where they're destined, come what may. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night, says the inscription, stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. And one reason, of course, that I love this is Herodotus is the kind of poster boy of all historians, the father of history. But he's not actually talking about the efficiency of postal workers in ancient Greece, but those in Persia. And I always wonder what it is that the mullahs in Tehran might make of the fact that the greatest city on earth has words written about their efficiency on their post office building walls. Of course, here in the US, people have very strong ideas about lots of different things, but they also have strong ideas about the aesthetic value of classical architecture and also its function in inspiring good citizenship, because good buildings breed good virtues. That's an old story, and everyone will have their own political opinions. I'm not here to cause fights, but this is an executive order passed by Donald Trump, one of the last acts as president, an executive order on promoting beautiful federal civic architectures. This is quite an interesting order. The Founding Fathers, I'll read it in case you can't quite make it out behind me. He said, the Founding Fathers wanted America's public buildings to inspire the American people and to encourage civic virtue. President George Washington, I wish I could do his voice, but anyway, I'm not going to. President George Washington and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson consciously modeled the most important buildings in Washington, D.C. on the classical architecture of ancient Athens and Rome. They sought to use classical architecture to visually connect our contemporary republic with the antecedents of democracy and classical antiquity. This is what makes being a historian just a joy, where you start to wonder, is this correct? Why do these ideas come from? How do they perpetuate themselves? Is Trump right that this is what the Founding Fathers thought? And you'll have to look back at my first lecture to see my views on that. But federal architecture, America's federal architecture, says the order continue to be characterized by beautiful and beloved buildings. This is very subjective, of largely, though not exclusively, if not exclusively classical design, listing several examples, as you can see. Classical architecture, it said, from now on should be the preferred and default architecture for federal public buildings, absent exceptional factors necessitating another kind of architecture. So that link back to the classical world is one that is not just alive, it is formal US government policy, passed by a man who knew he wasn't going to be president anymore. Well, I guess he'd figured it out by that point, but maybe not. But was so important to him that determining the shape of what government buildings in this country looked like and using the models of classical Greece and Rome was enshrined in law. Now, whether he was right that good-looking buildings or classical buildings inspire better citizens is also a topic for another night. But I think it's also useful to remind ourselves that the single most symbolic, iconic monument, I suppose, in the whole United States, if not New York, if not the whole United States, is also a conscious recasting of a classical Greek image, that of the Colossus of Rhodes. And here, Lady Liberty, the first thing anybody arriving by sea would have a look at. So all of these examples remind us of the extraordinary impact of the classical age and its legacies and influences on the contemporary world and on the future. Remember that executive order determines what new buildings are going to look like rather than impacting old ones. And so too does this building that we're in ourselves, in fact, this evening. I've got a slide out of place. So here we go. So this cathedral, this church rather, is named after Saint Bartholomew, also the name of the current ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople. St. Bartholomew, as all of you will know, was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus Christ. And I suppose it's a sort of thing we just take in our strides, that it's not sort of strange that a man born 2,000 years ago who wasn't Jesus Christ, 5,000 years ago, has a church in his honor here on Park Avenue. That seems to me quite interesting because his legacy was also therefore a global one. And in fact, so too was his life. So what we know about St. Bartholomew, there are different traditions. One of the the strongest ones is that Bartholomew tried to convert the king of Armenia and was martyred. In fact, a successor of the king of Armenia, Tiridates III, Tiridates, we call him in classical style, was the first ruler to convert to Christianity about 3 centuries later. But other traditions have St. Bartholomew journeying much further into the east And in fact, my slide wasn't out of place. This is an old English martyrology from the 9th century that says that King Alfred the Great, in thanks to God for having seen off a Viking attack on London, sent 2 men out to go and worship at the tombs of St. Thomas in India and St. Bartholomew. And the martyrology, rightly or wrongly, claims that Bartholomew was Christ's missionary in the country of India, which is the outermost of all regions. So Bartholomew span from New York, the Holy Land, Armenia, and India reminds us, I think, about these global and important connections. And in fact, his range is even more extensive than that, because relics said to belong to Bartholomew, St. Bartholomew, were first preserved in Dara, in what's now Syria. It was an important Byzantine fort that changed hands multiple times with the Persians. But other relics were later moved in time, or were claimed to have been moved, to here the Cathedral of St. Bartholomew in Lipari, just north of Sicily, a beautiful cathedral. Then to the Cathedral of San Bartolomeo in Benevento, and then relics after that to places like Frankfurt, Rome, and even in Canterbury Cathedral. So these global connections that tie us all together here, this is a very suitable location to be speaking. But so too is the specific building. It's not just because it's dedicated to St. Bartholomew, but this building was built in the so-called Byzantine revival style. So it means all of you sitting here this evening will be in the same liturgical, architectural context as anybody sitting or visiting or praying churches all over the world. So the Cathedral of St. Sava in Belgrade, the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Sofia, Westminster Cathedral. I was a choir boy when I was small. I came to sing here when I was 11 or 12 years old. The Nativity Cathedral in Riga. These styles are all joining us together in that Byzantine tradition. And perhaps most poignantly on today, the Cathedral of the Assumption in Kharkiv, which I'm sure you all know was badly damaged, if I'm on the right slide, by Russian artillery last week. We should remind ourselves, I think, of these connections. But I'm also here to be a little bit more upbeat. I will come back to some of the worries that we might have lying ahead of us. But if you really want to see the widest possible chronological and geographical spread of the Byzantine tradition, and where epic struggles lead to struggles between imperial forces and those yearning for freedom, and a clash that's at least as intense as that between the Greeks and the Trojans, or the Persians and the Greeks, or the Athenians and the Spartans, then as any historian, I know there are a few of you here this evening, will know that all historians' favourite time and period is in a galaxy far away, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, with Star Wars, where the models of those Byzantine basilicas and cathedrals are very obvious. What's so much then for the setting of what it tells us about the ties that link us together, that join us over millennia without even thinking about it. We take these things in our stride. But I will sort of lead in by just mentioning that in the Orthodox tradition, there's a hymn in the Kontakion which says about St. Bartholomew, "You have appeared to the universe as a great sun, shining with the radiance of your teaching and awesome miracles. Enlighten those who honour you, Apostle of the Lord, St. Bartholomew." So that's quite a good way to, I think, feel that we might learn something this evening, and I hope that you do. So I left the last lecture with the Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire, which had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries before its fall in 1453. And the demise of that empire brought about dramatic changes for those who lived in territories that were now controlled by the Ottoman Turks. Those who had been subjects of a Christian Orthodox emperor now found themselves owing allegiance and service to a Muslim sultan, as well as being forced to pay taxes at a higher rate than their Muslim peers did, which left them, of course, at a financial disadvantage. On top of this was the devshirme, the notorious child levy that required families to give up their sons for military service and involved forcible conversion to Islam. So for most, the arrival of the Turks brought about a decline in circumstances that was precipitous and extremely difficult and lasted for 400 years, or nearly 400 years. But there were some who adapted and even flourished after the fall of the Queen of the Cities. The Ottomans reached a series of accommodations, eventually with the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was treated as the effective representative of all Christians in the lands that had been conquered, and given a responsibility for collecting all the revenues in return for recognition, patronage and protection. This proved an attractive proposition and one that gave plenty of space for personal projects to be followed through. But alongside the patriarch emerged a group of families that became collectively known as the Phanariotis, or the Phanariots, who managed to build up considerable fortunes as a result of their own business acumen through cooperating with each other, through reliable service to Ottoman overlords who relied on their expertise that they could bring from trading connections with Greek communities outside the empire that I'm going to say something about too. And rewarding these Phanariot families was an extremely useful way for the Ottomans to not reward those who might be talented and ambitious closer to home. So over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, Christian converts in particular, but others too, found themselves appointed to very high positions within the Ottoman court, allowing some form of continuity to carry on, even if though that didn't work at ground level. So there were twin policies: selective promotion and reward for some of those from Greek-speaking backgrounds, and diminished possibilities and circumstances for the majority who lived in the countryside. And this period, as many of you will know, is known as the Turkokratia, which is often, it actually just means Turkish rule, but is synonymous in Greece with Turkish tyranny. This is a period of darkness and suffering. But for Greek speakers who lived outside the Ottoman world, it was another story. Even before the fall of Constantinople, Greek intellectuals and artists had begun to sow seeds that germinated in other parts of Europe. Colonies swelled in places like Venice, with refugees fleeing ahead of the Turkish advance and bringing with them ideas, books, texts, and cultural models to copy, emulate, and improve on. Until the 1400s, Greek had been largely ignored in centres of learning, with very few scholars in Italy, France, or beyond being acquainted with secular texts or commentaries on religious doctrines. So the Bible, for example, had been translated into Latin only in many countries in centuries before, and had become the standard template for priests to communicate the liturgy and to discuss and interpret complex problems. So the arrival of Greeks with texts and books and expertise brought about a blossoming of an ability to engage with a whole set of ideas in a different way. And as Dr. Yuripoulou said, one of these early printed texts from 1488 in the library in Florence, exactly testimony to the kinds of ways that the Iliad, the text that was on the video, brought new ideas and new stories into new hands and new heads. And this helped galvanize Europe in all sorts of interesting ways. I suppose on the one hand, it wasn't surprising that Italian city-states and republics would find models about the rivalries between Athens and Sparta, or why others would see confrontations of tyrannical empires with the cities and peoples of ancient Greece and the Persians. But there were more direct implications too that brought about a series of revolutions. Scholars like Erasmus, who'd studied Greek at the University of Padua, were now able to read the Gospels in the language in which they'd been written, and that gave them the ability to critique and criticize poor and inaccurate translations that had been done in Latin by the Catholic Church, and also gave scholars like Erasmus the right to render texts into more accurate local languages that, at a stroke, transformed and challenged the stranglehold that the Church had over the control of information and education, and with that, social mobility too. So Martin Luther, for example, was adamant that all children should be able to read the scriptures for themselves, and that literacy was essential for both boys and for girls, which was highly unusual at the time. And the extraordinary consequence of those policies was that every country in Europe that had a Protestant majority achieved full literacy by 1900, and not a single one with a Catholic majority did. So the development of the printing press was a crucial element in the dissemination of new ideas, new texts, new translations. There's the printing ability to be able to put error-free copies available, but also to have them produced at scale and much cheaper was important. But it was the sparks that came from Constantinople and from Byzantium that lit the flames that set fire to Europe during the Reformation. It wasn't just religious ideas that were transformative, because they also did the same in fields of geography, science, and mathematics. It's no surprise, those of you who remember your maths, all those Greek letters, why we had to remember what pi was to 7 or 17 different places, but also the words like trigonometry and isosceles, all came from the fact that this came not just from the Greek classical scholars and mathematicians, but transferred from Byzantium. And that discovery, or the rediscovery of Greek, I think is important to see the other dividends that paid, not least when it came to the question of independence that happened 201 years ago, began 201 years ago. Set against other independence movements, those events of 1821 are really tricky to understand. They are anomalous, highly abnormal, and very difficult to explain. Independence movements normally start with internal uprisings, or they start with discontent resulting from exclusion from political processes, or persecution, or discrimination, or they arise from local elites chancing their arm to try to take advantage of vacuums of power to take greater powers for themselves. And all of those three explanations, I think, would apply if one wanted to look at the independence of this great country. But the case of Greece is very different. Pressure didn't come from inside the Greek-speaking world. They had been conquered by the Ottomans. In fact, there was almost no uprisings, partly because the Ottomans put them down very effectively. But all of the pressure came from the outside Greek diaspora, and in particular from those who had links with Russia, such as Yannis Kapodistrias and Alexander Ypsilanti, who both had held senior positions in the Russian Tsarist services. But also they came from well-wishers, idealists, and supporters who had no connection with Greece, except to their romanticized ideals about the past. And such were these ideals about ancient Greece that they served not just as an inspiration, but of emulation. So, as the art historian Johann Winkelmann put it in the 1760s, the only way to become great, he said, is to imitate the ancients. And as I mentioned, these attitudes live on with some here in the United States. This is why we have buildings all over the world that look like classical buildings and temples. That project of Greek independence was not a national movement, therefore, as much as an international one. The hour has come, O men of Hellas, urged Ypsilanti at the start of the revolution. The enlightened peoples of Europe, full of gratitude for the benefits bequeathed by our ancestors to themselves, eagerly await the liberty of the Hellenes. The independence of Greece, in other words, was not just to the benefit of Greeks, but to all the peoples who'd benefited from the wisdom and achievements of the ancients and now needed to repay those debts. It was a very powerful cocktail, made more potent by the extensive use of classical models in the American Declaration and the War of Independence of the 1770s, and for that matter in the French Revolution of 1789, both of which set freedom, liberty in terms that drew heavily on Greek literature, philosophy, and art forms. The parallels between these struggles too created a language that was easy to understand when it came to seeking support, and this reminded me a lot of Ukraine when I was working on it. Men of American society, one leader of independence movement in Greece, urged, facing the dilemma of dying or living for freedom, we find ourselves close to you because freedom chose your country as a home. Bring us closer to you, despite the fact that we are separated by vast seas. Our shared interest strengthens our alliance, which is based on the freedom of virtue. And I think those are words that one could hear very clearly from Kiev at the moment. Alexander Korais, one of the most important protagonists in the movement, put it even more simply when he wrote to former President Thomas Jefferson in 1823. Help us, happy Americans, he said. We are not asking for charity. We are giving you the opportunity to enhance your own happiness. Greek independence wasn't just for the benefit of Greeks, in other words, it would benefit Americans too. As it happened, this was the case, although not quite in ways that Korais or Jefferson might have understood, because Greek-speaking colonies had sprung up ever since antiquity all around the Black Sea, as well as into the Adriatic, Sicily, North Africa, and the Balearics and beyond. And few of those had stayed static in the modern era, but the principle of new clusters, groups of Greeks setting themselves up in faraway lands, talking about their pasts, keeping Greek languages and beliefs alive, was hugely important and found echoes well into the age of European colonial expansion. One particularly important community was in what is now Ukraine, where perhaps as many as 250,000 Greek speakers settled after the conquest of Crimea and the Black Sea coast by Catherine the Great's armies in the 1770s. These annexations were conceptualized as the creation of a new Russia, or Novorossiya, the echoes of history as we hear them today, that involved the extension of Russian imperial control into regions that were presented as being a reclamation of traditional lands that had once been subject to the Rurikid princes of Kiev. But despite attempts to Russify lands taken from the Crimean Tatars, the descendants of the Mongols who'd conquered it hundreds of years ago, the character and names of these new towns and cities were not Russian, but they were Greek in origin. Kherson was named after an ancient city of the same name, although confusingly in a completely different location. Then there was Nikopol, which was named after the goddess Nike, the goddess of victory. Odessa, named both after Odysseus, the greatest of all, not just Greek travelers, but all travelers, and the city of Odessos that had been founded in antiquity, and the tragic city of Mariupol, named after the Virgin Mary. There were important communities of Greek speakers elsewhere in the Black Sea too, most notably in the Pontus region in northern Asia Minor, above all centered around Trebizond, and the city of Kars, which was then subsumed into Russia and then Turkey after the First World War. But Greeks had by that point already fanned out to all corners of the world, to London, Amsterdam, and Bengal, and in the early 20th century began to flood into the Americas and also to Australia. Some of this was opportunistic, as was the case with Greeks coming from islands like Ithaca and Kythera that went to Australia, enticed by gold rushes and the attempt to cash in, but also by the bruising conflicts of the early 1900s, the Balkan Wars and the First World War, and the ethnikos diachasmos, the national schism that provided a strong incentive to look for new opportunities in a rapidly changing world. Emigration was welcomed in some parts of the world, but not all, and in fact in many places Greeks were met with extreme prejudice in many parts of the so-called New World as a threat to other white Europeans. And an example of this comes from William Woodhouse, who was Professor of Greek at the University of Sydney a century ago. And one might have expected a man well versed in Greek language, literature and culture to be sympathetic to those coming to Australia with Greek backgrounds, but far from it. I'm not in favour of the introduction into a vigorous young country like Australia of peoples from the decadent nations of southern Europe, he wrote in 1922. Be they Italians, Spaniards or Greek, they're not the most desirable foundation for a young nation. It was not that Australia didn't need or shouldn't welcome settlers, he said. He just had strong ideas about who would be desirable. Quote, the class of new settlers that should be invited and encouraged to Australia are the peoples of Northern Europe, Danes, Swedes and Norwegians. Woodhouse had spent the last year travelling in Greece extensively and had only just returned to Australia. After spending a number of months travelling with the people of Southern Europe, he wrote, I went with a fixed purpose which I went to view with a fixed purpose. I'm quite convinced they are not a desirable class of immigrants. They are merely a shifting, parasitic population. Such views were not uncommon in other places where Greeks, and for that matter, others from Southern Europe, moved in large numbers, largely because those who moved were almost all unskilled, poorly educated, and from rural backgrounds that inevitably shocked them, who expected that all Greeks would look like Achilles, would be able to quote Homer, and show all of the personal characteristics of the heroes of the ancient world. That's what I expect when I fly into Athens airport, and I'm never disappointed. So there were two different circuits to diaspora populations which slowly merged over time. So there were elite groups of merchants, traders and entrepreneurs who were extremely successful in building up dominant positions in Constantinople. For example, by the end of the late 19th century, Greek families in the cities dominated the banking system and were responsible for bringing in almost all investment to the Ottoman Empire from outside. Others did really well in cities like Smyrna, a city that eventually became known as the Paris of the Levant because of the amount of export and import coming through the port. Then there was the Greek community in Egypt, where fortune soared in the late 19th century, partly as a result of the boom in textile production that made Alexandria and Cairo two of the most glamorous cities in the world. And men like Emmanuel Benakis, whose famous museum in Athens is a jewel in that city's crown, spending time in Egypt making his fortune there, thanks to cotton prices that surged after the American Civil War. Greeks living abroad saw their identity, though, not as stemming from land and the region of Greece, but from their families, from their language, and from their values, as well as from their orthodox religion. So perhaps the most famous Greek poet of all in the modern era, Constantine Cavafy, who was born in Alexandria and spent almost all of his life there, writing poetry of breathtaking quality, originality, and beauty, that made regular references to Greece, to Greek themes, both ancient and modern, but had little to do and little interest in travelling to parts of the world that was at that time the kingdom of Greece. So for Cavafy and for many others, Greek identity was not linked to land or even to ethnicity, but to personal feelings. And I didn't show my text to Dr. Europoulou to Fokien beforehand, but it was a lovely thing to hear both of them quote Percy Shelley's famous statement that we're all Greeks, because Shelley believed and said that we're all bound by the laws of religion and art that originate one way or another in Greece. And although I've tried to show there are two sides to that particular coin, I think the importance of being able to share ideas, of being able to all put differences beside us or behind us and to talk as friends and as one is hugely important. And I think that's a good point and jumping off point to be thinking about how Greece in the modern day moves into a future when not all of the world wants to be Greeks, when not everybody wants to respect and share the freedoms that we value so dearly, where not everybody believes that cooperation and collaboration are the model to be followed, but disruption and violence and force should win. So the theme of these three lectures has been global Greece, and the aim has been to see how Greece has had much more extensive interactions across time and space in all parts of the world. And this is important, I think, in the 21st century, as regardless of your personal political views and beliefs and affiliations, I think it's clear that we're living through an age of multiple revolutions. And I'm going to talk about four in particular and how they might affect the future for Greece and Greeks, and in fact for others as well. Well, so the first revolution was well underway before the 24th of February 2022 when Russian forces invaded Ukraine. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've seen seismic shifts in global geopolitics whose implications were poorly understood at the time and even more poorly prepared for. One of those has been the change in China, which has seen by far the fastest and largest urbanization in human history, something that can be simply exemplified illustrated by the fact that China used more concrete in 35 months about 10 years ago than the United States did in the entire 20th century. Another of these seismic changes has been the direction that Russia has traveled, that, as I discussed in my last lecture, was clear to those who only saw what the reality was rather than what they wanted to see. And these geopolitical changes are all around us. China and Russia, obvious, but you are hard-pressed to find anything in the news about South America or Latin America, almost nothing about Sub-Saharan Africa. Central and Southeast Asia remain complete mysteries and only referenced in crisis. Even in corridors of power, I should say. That overwhelming lens of focus through which led Europeans to misunderstand history, as Dr. Larry mentioned, how we need to understand the history of Iran, Persia, and connections, has the danger of misleading us again by only looking at the brightest flashing lights in front of us. So a global and a globalized world requires a global education and global perspectives, something that I'm pleased to say we're seeing in many governments around the world at long last, including in Athens, where I'll just walk you through some of the things that have caught my eye in recent weeks and months. For example, high-level interactions with Rwanda, where, unlike my own country, so far as I know, the Greek government are not proposing to put refugees who try to get into Greece. Also, engagement with Greek diasporas in Latin America, increasingly regular feature of Greek policy, and also with India. And what's, I think, very striking in connections with countries like India is the first thing that the Indian government want to do is to emphasize interactions back over history. So a recent readout from the Indian embassy in Athens, and good evening if there are any Indian embassy officials here this evening, records that interaction between India and Greece goes back to antiquity, and India's contact with Greece began 2,500 years ago. So Greeks and Indians are all Greeks or all Indians. It just, I think, is important to underline how important it is to share commitments that we're on the same page. And as the readout goes on, Indians and Greeks share the commitment to justice, equality, peace and democracy. But it also approvingly notes Alexander the Great did not cross the Indus into India, but instead turned south and went back to Babylon. That's a relief, otherwise we could have had another diplomatic incident. But that takes me back to the very first paragraph of my opening lecture in Athens, in the first of the series, where I'd reminded how the Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, had told the visiting leader Xi Jinping that our country are bearers of great civilizations that seeded the course of humanity, thoughts that were echoed, of course, by the Chinese themselves. So this idea of, I think, of joining and drawing on history as a way of finding common language is hugely important, but it needs more than just the niceties of diplomatic rhetoric. So it's striking to see, again, in the case of Greece, how that lens is moving. And some of you who follow this will know more about this than you need to hear from me. But for example, it's completely inconceivable to me that 20 years ago the Greek Navy and that of the UAE would be conducting joint naval exercises, nor that there would be joint training exercises between Greek forces and those of Egypt, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE as well. These are really important and striking developments in seeing that Greece's neighbourhood yard is not confined to just its land neighbours. These are constantly taking place all the time, including discussions, of course, about what the purpose of these exercises are, but also environments that bring in other countries to the Filia Forum that includes France, as you can see, as well as Egypt, but also Bahrain and Syria and Jordan, Iraq, I beg your pardon, and Jordan. Some of that is driven by the necessities of what Greece has been through. Here another forum of the Republic of Cyprus, Greece, and Israel, the 3+1, and the US. All these different arenas to try to find ways of talking are hugely important, and they either show forward planning or anxieties, and I suspect it's probably a bit of both. Some of those anxieties to do with the Arab Spring that we've completely forgotten about, that 10 years ago shortages of food and high inflation caused North Africa and then the Middle East to catch fire, as we go into a summer where we're already seeing some of those pressures hitting other parts of the world. The Prime Minister of Sri Lanka resigning yesterday, curfews on the streets of Peru and Lima in Peru, and so on, about what's coming. And of course, Greece caught by surprise, like all of Europe was, not just by the speed, but by the scale of the refugee crisis 7 years ago. Some of that is preempting some of these discussions and trying to think through preparations for a changing world. Some of those are stoked by what it is that other actors are doing. One never acts in a vacuum. And the crisis in Ukraine has obviously given Turkey a higher set of muscles to be able to express its own interests, ambitions and aims in a way that is extremely threatening if there is no agreement. And the relations between Greece and Turkey, you don't need me to remind you, have been very touchy and difficult for many centuries since independence, of course, but disputes specifically over gas fields in the East Mediterranean was why Cyprus ended up being split into two, an invasion in 1974. So understanding what it is that other people in the neighbourhood are trying to do as well is important. And if you think Rwanda's impressive, Turkey's been opening up embassies and diplomatic missions all over Africa. In fact, the largest single Turkish diplomatic mission anywhere in the world today is not in Washington, D.C., or in Athens, or in London, but in Somalia. And we should be thinking through why these things are happening, so we are not caught by surprise. Some of these things are really quite serious. So there were supposed to be joint exercises that were cancelled, joint exercise between Greek and Turkish air forces. And at the end of April, in fact, there were, over a 24-hour period, 125 unauthorized violations of Greek airspace by Turkish fighter planes. I think these things are serious at any time, but particularly in the opportunistic world that we are currently going through because of Russia and Ukraine. So in the short term, that's going to lead to high levels of defense spending, which we've already seen. This was already before the Ukraine crisis and invasion. And in fact, Greece already, if you can see the chart behind, I'm not going to go and point because I've got to keep going, spends the most by far of any European country of its GDP on defense, other than Estonia, which used to be part of the Soviet Union, has a land border with Russia, has very good reasons to be terrified about its future. So these ideas, I think, around what geopolitical jigsaws look like require some considerable thought and preparation for best and worst case scenarios. If I had more time, I would talk about what this means, what China's role in the East Mediterranean means, because that will have a long-term implication, not just because of Chinese control of the port of Piraeus, but I suspect that will be for another time. And in any event, other challenges and questions, I think, are more important even than what China is doing, at least for the time being. But I want to talk about two other major global trends that are hugely important in determining and shaping Greece's future. The first is climate and climate change, which I've spent the last few years working on, and in fact will be the subject of a new book that will come out in the spring. And climatic change is already having dramatic impacts on regions that we spend too little time thinking about. But the acceleration of what's coming towards us, I think, requires a great deal of thought and preparation, because the cascade effects of climate are never that we suddenly get too hot, although those of you who remember the fires that are almost impossible to forget, the apocalyptic fires last summer in Greece, will know that the problems are real. But each single 1% reduction in overnight stays in the Greek tourism industry costs about 900 million euros, each 1%. So those tipping points can cascade quite quickly, particularly at a time when we are all stressed at national budget level because of pandemic spending. So it goes without saying that investments into clean energy to provide greater energy independence are significant. And in fact, in Greece's case, capital was going into some of these before the question of energy independence was thrown into sharp relief by recent developments in Ukraine and by Russia being sanctioned and turning off the taps of its oil and gas, at least in some parts of Europe. But to avoid the inflationary economic and political shocks may produce questions that become more dramatic than what China's doing in the short term. That's one, I think, of the big long-term things too. Another is that even if energy and climate can be solved or mitigated through careful planning, it's not so clear that another time bomb will be diffused quite so easily. So in like many countries in the world, particularly developed worlds, states are facing a very dangerous combination of falling fertility and rising age. So according to The Lancet, the big medical journal, Greece's population might fall by something like 40% by the end of the century, which has some upsides for consumption of food and energy resources, but serious implications about what that means for young people, particularly with rising life expectancy. It's great that we all get to live longer, but it means that fewer and fewer young people have an ever greater burden on their shoulders. Here's an idea of where we are already, and then a pretty dramatic graph behind me. And it's highly likely that new technologies will play some role in mitigating, maybe alleviating, maybe even eliminating those problems. Maybe we'll all be fine and live happy, but I probably should remind as a historian that even if we get the next decades free of pandemics, major military confrontations, or accelerated shortages, particularly food, these are all hallmarks of human history for millennia, and we'd be foolish to think that we are immune from them. All generations think that technologies will save them, and they rarely do. But my greater concern, I think, about the equation into an increasingly unfriendly and more pessimistic world is that those transitions are not easy. As it is, my fourth big trend is that workers in Greece work some of the longest hours in the world, here right up at the top, third in the list behind me, although productivity, where Greece is quite low down, it's never quite clear if there's a correlation between these two outcomes. But these should provide some warning signs about whether one of the cradles of democracy needs to be looked after very carefully by the government and by... These are common problems shared all over the developed world. One of the challenges is about youth unemployment. Here you see how it spiked during the financial crisis. We've been mercifully okay for the last 2 years, largely because businesses have been kept afloat by governments, including non-viable ones. But the change in the winds are not just restricted to what's happening in Moscow and decisions made there. We are becoming, in Europe, more xenophobic, more hostile, more guarded, more worried. And those kinds of themes are dangerous because they set precedents. So the ideas about who should be allowed to leave Greece, can you stop people exercising the freedom to emigrate? One of the things that made Greek so famous, those journeys of Odysseus. If he was left up to the voters today, many would choose to say he should never get on the boat in the first place, nor any of the fleet to go and avenge the theft and rape of Helen. But also the dissatisfaction with democracy should be ringing rather loud warning bells. And in Greece, those dissatisfaction levels, here with the research done by the Pew Foundation, shows just how bad that is. And we're looking here at 74% of those who are living in the cradle of democracy, where Athenian democracy shaped so many of those ideas on which even this country, the United States, was self-consciously built, is hugely significant. Greece is at the sharp end of this trend in Europe, and in fact Greece is at the sharp end of this trend globally. Only Brazil with Bolsonaro is anywhere close, and even in the case of Brazil, one might try to understand why that's the case. These anomalous ways in which Greece Greek identity behave, I think we should be keeping a very careful watch on. So, as a historian, I'm acutely aware of the difficulties and dangers of trying to guess the future. Historians make very bad predictors. I think it's much better to try to look at the past, as I've done in each of these 3 lectures. But the 4 megatrends that I focused on here in the second part of my talk, geopolitical shifts, climate, demographic change, and the overspill into what citizens want, what they demand, and what they expect and need from the states, are all 4 major themes that historians spend their time looking at, and with very good reason. Greece has always been global, and maintaining a global perspective will be vital as it faces an uncertain future, as all of us do today on this planet. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Peter, for a wide-ranging, insightful, and brilliant lecture tonight. Taking us from the past to the present with what you might know. I'm just going to speak really loudly. In the face of technology that fails, I wanted to say to Peter Frankopan, thank you for a brilliant and insightful lecture that has taken us from the past to the present, that has spanned many trends, many issues, and many ideas, that has put in relief the questions that democracies around the world face, that has centered Greece, its legacy, and its future in those conversations, and that has given us an enormous amount to think about as we contemplate the ongoing impact of climate change, the ways in which emigration and immigration change the way we as individuals feel about ourselves and about our countries, the ways in which shifting alliances create new networks that weren't imaginable even a decade ago. And most importantly, Peter, you have inspired us to think about Greece in a global context and in a way in which all of us, to come back to that great Shelley quote, can feel part of this extraordinary legacy. So thank you for making us tonight feel embraced by the concept of Greece, its history, and most importantly, its future.